My father laughed so loudly that several people waiting outside the White House turned to look. He held his cream-colored invitation above his head like he'd won the lottery. "You weren't invited," he said with a smug grin. "Guess they finally figured out who's actually accomplished something in this family." I looked at him for a second, then down at the invitation in my hand. I could have argued. 10 years earlier, maybe I would have. But by 38, I'd learned something about people who enjoy embarrassing you in public. They don't stop because you defend yourself. They stop when reality quietly proves them wrong. So I stepped forward and handed my invitation to the young woman behind the check-in desk. She smiled politely, scanned the QR code, and waited. Then everything changed. The scanner gave a soft chime. Her smile disappeared. She looked at the screen once, then again. Without saying a word, she turned toward a Navy admiral standing about 20 feet away near the security entrance. He immediately noticed her expression. She swallowed hard. "Sir," she called. The admiral walked over. She lowered her voice. "She's here." For just a moment, nobody spoke. Not my father. Not my brother. Not even me. The admiral looked directly at me, smiled warmly, and said, "Ms. Carter, we've been expecting you." You could have heard a pin drop. My name is Emily Carter, and until that morning, my father believed I was the least successful person in our family. To understand why that moment mattered, I have to take you back a little. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a perfectly ordinary brick ranch house where football was king, military service was respected, and appearances mattered more than anyone admitted. My older brother Mark was the family hero. He deserved plenty of the praise he received. He worked hard, joined the Navy after college, and eventually became a commander. He was disciplined, confident, and genuinely good at what he did. The problem wasn't Mark. The problem was that once he started collecting accomplishments, everyone else in the family became invisible, especially me. Whenever relatives gathered for Thanksgiving or Christmas, Dad would clap Mark on the shoulder. "That's my son," he'd say proudly. Then someone would ask about me. Dad usually answered before I could. "Emily works on computers for the government." That was it. No mention of promotions. No mention of projects. Certainly no mention of why I disappeared overseas for weeks at a time, or why I occasionally missed birthdays because I was on assignment. None of that could be discussed anyway. My job required security clearances thicker than most novels. I signed enough non-disclosure agreements to wallpaper my first apartment. Keeping quiet wasn't optional. It was my responsibility. Dad interpreted my silence as proof that nothing important was happening. "Government desk job," he'd joke. "Probably spends all day resetting passwords." Everybody laughed. Eventually, I laughed too. It was easier. After graduating from Virginia Tech with a degree in computer engineering, I joined a civilian cybersecurity program that partnered closely with the Department of the Navy. Most Americans never hear about people like us. We're not spies. We're not soldiers. We build systems. We find vulnerabilities before someone else does. Sometimes we spend 6 months solving a problem nobody outside our office ever knows existed. If we do everything right, nothing happens. That's success. It isn't glamorous. You don't get parades because nothing exploded. You don't make headlines because a crisis never occurred. For years, I was perfectly happy living that way, until family expectations started turning quiet into invisible. 3 weeks before the White House ceremony, a courier delivered a sealed envelope to my townhouse in Alexandria, Virginia. It required my signature. Inside was a formal invitation embossed with the presidential seal. I read it 3 times. I honestly thought they had sent it to the wrong Emily Carter. A secure phone number inside instructed me to call. After several identity checks, a woman calmly confirmed there had been no mistake. "We look forward to seeing you." That was all she said. No explanation. No details. Just instructions about arrival time, security, screening, and dress code. I stared at the invitation for nearly an hour. Part of me wanted to tell someone. Instead, I slipped it back into the envelope. Classified work teaches you strange habits. You stop talking. Even good news. Especially good news. A week later, Mom called. "Did you hear?" she asked excitedly. "Your father and Mark were invited to a White House ceremony." "That's wonderful. They each get guest credentials. Isn't that exciting?" "It really is." She paused. "I wish you could come." I smiled despite myself. "Me too." It wasn't exactly a lie. The morning of the ceremony was warm for early May. Washington looked beautiful. The trees along Pennsylvania Avenue had filled out into thick green canopies, and tourists lined the sidewalks snapping pictures. Security around the White House was exactly what you'd expect. Secret Service officers, metal barricades, police cruisers, Dozens of sharply dressed guests moving through orderly lines. I spotted my parents before they noticed me. Dad looked proud enough to burst. Dark navy suit? American flag tie. Brand new shoes Mom had probably convinced him to buy. Mark wore his dress whites. He looked impressive. Mom hugged me. I didn't know you were coming downtown today. I had something to attend. Dad raised an eyebrow. What kind of meeting? Oh, work. He chuckled. Near the White House. Something like that. Then he noticed I was standing in the same line. He frowned. You know this entrance is only for invited guests. I know. He laughed. Emily, don't make this awkward. I won't. He held up his invitation. This is different. I understand. Then came the words I'd heard in one form or another my entire life. You weren't invited. He wasn't yelling. That somehow made it sting more. A couple standing nearby pretended not to listen. Mark shifted uncomfortably but stayed silent. Mom looked at the ground. Nobody defended me. Nobody ever did. Instead, I stepped forward. I handed over my invitation. The young hostess scanned it. Everything changed. The Admiral approached. He smiled. Ms. Carter, he said. Welcome. We've been waiting for you. Behind me, my father's face slowly lost every bit of color. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The Admiral didn't say anything dramatic. He didn't salute me. He didn't introduce me to the crowd. He simply smiled the way someone does when they're greeting a colleague they've known for years. Good morning, Ms. Carter, he said. It's good to finally see you in person. I smiled back. Thank you, Admiral. He extended his hand and we shook. I hope your trip over from Alexandria wasn't too bad. Traffic on I-395 behaved for once. He laughed. That's probably the biggest miracle we'll witness today. A couple of people standing nearby smiled politely. It was such an ordinary conversation. That somehow made it even more confusing for my family. Dad blinked twice. You know each other? The Admiral turned toward him. We've worked together for several years. Then he looked back at me. We'll get you inside shortly. He nodded once before walking away toward another group of guests. I stood there holding my purse while my father stared at me as though I'd suddenly started speaking another language. What exactly was that? He asked. Just someone I know through work? Dad frowned. You've never mentioned knowing an Admiral. I've never been allowed to. That answer only irritated him. There you go again. There I go making everything sound mysterious. I almost laughed. If only he knew how many conversations in my career ended exactly like that. People assumed silence meant exaggeration. In reality, silence usually meant paperwork. The hostess returned with another staff member wearing an earpiece. Ms. Carter. Yes, if you'll come with me, please. Dad stepped forward. We're together. The woman smiled politely. I'm sorry, sir. Ms. Carter has separate credentials. Separate credentials. Those two words landed harder than any argument ever could. For the first time all morning, Dad didn't have an answer. I followed the staff member through another security checkpoint without looking back. Not because I wanted to embarrass my family. Honestly, I didn't know what was happening myself. As we walked through the White House grounds, memories kept surfacing that I hadn't thought about in years. Funny how one unexpected morning can reopen decades of old conversations. Growing up, I wasn't the difficult child. I wasn't rebellious. I got good grades. Stayed out of trouble. Worked part-time at the public library during high school. The librarians loved me because I always put books back exactly where they belonged. Dad used to joke that I alphabetized cereal boxes. He wasn't completely wrong. I liked solving puzzles, finding patterns, organizing chaos. When I was 14, I entered the Ohio Science Fair with a project about early computer network security. Most kids built volcanoes. I built a simulated intrusion detection program. It wasn't flashy, but it won first place. I remember rushing home with the blue ribbon. Dad looked up from a football game. That's nice, sweetheart. Then he turned back toward the television. 20 minutes later, Mark came home after making varsity quarterback. Dad practically called the neighbors. Looking back now, I don't think he meant to hurt me. He simply understood touchdowns better than technology. Still, children notice those things. Even when parents don't. Things became more obvious after college. Mark attended the Naval Academy before beginning his military career. Every promotion became a family celebration. Every transfer meant another framed photograph on Mom's hallway wall. When I graduated from Virginia Tech with honors, Dad hugged me and said something I'll never forget. So, what are you going to do with computers? At the time, I didn't know either. 3 months later, I interviewed for a civilian research position supporting Navy cybersecurity initiatives. The hiring process took almost 7 months. Background investigations, financial reviews, polygraphs, medical exams. Psychological evaluations. By the time I finally received my security clearance, I understood why so few people ever talked about these jobs. Most couldn't. My first assignment wasn't glamorous. I worked in a windowless office in Norfolk reviewing software vulnerabilities. For 8 months. Every morning began the same way. Coffee. Badge through 3 security doors. Lock my phone away. Spend 10 hours staring at code. Go home. Repeat. It sounds boring. Sometimes it was. But little by little I started understanding how enormous our responsibility actually was. Every weak password, every overlooked update, every tiny programming mistake could become someone's doorway into military systems. Nobody outside our building ever saw those victories. That was the point. If we succeeded, nobody noticed. Family reunions became awkward. Still fixing computers, Uncle Larry would ask. I work in cybersecurity. So I take, sort of. Dad usually jumped in. Government office. Then everyone moved on. Mark's deployments always made better stories. He had ships, uniforms, medals. I had confidentiality agreements. One Thanksgiving, my cousin asked whether I'd ever worked with the FBI. Before I could answer, Dad laughed. Emily. She probably resets passwords for accountants. Everyone chuckled. Even Mark. Not because he was cruel. Because nobody knew better. I smiled, passed the mashed potatoes, changed the subject. Driving back to Virginia afterward, I cried somewhere outside Charleston, West Virginia. Not because they underestimated my job. Because after 15 years, they'd never once asked what I actually did. The only person who ever seemed to understand was my grandmother. She lived in a small white farmhouse outside Springfield, Ohio. Nothing fancy. A porch swing. A vegetable garden. Wind chimes that never stopped singing. She never asked questions I couldn't answer. Instead, she'd pour sweet tea and wait. One afternoon, she looked at me and smiled. You've gotten quieter, I guess. Important work usually does that. I looked at her. How do you know it's important? She shrugged. Because you never brag about it. Then she said something that stayed with me long after she passed away. Some people build monuments. She reached over and patted my hand. Others build the foundations underneath them. At the time, I wasn't sure what she meant. Years later, I finally understood. The White House staff member escorted me into a quiet reception room where coffee and pastries had been set out for early arrivals. Several military officers stood talking near tall windows overlooking the south lawn. One of them noticed me immediately. There she is. Another smiled. Emily, no last name. Just Emily. Like I'd been expected. Like I belonged there. I suddenly felt more nervous than I had all morning. Whatever this ceremony was, it clearly involved far more than I'd imagined. Then I heard raised voices drifting in from the hallway. My father's voice. Firm. Frustrated. There has to be some mistake. Someone answered calmly. I'm sorry, sir, but these credentials are correct. I closed my eyes for a second. Part of me wanted to walk back out and explain everything. Except, I couldn't. Not yet. Not until someone officially told the story that I'd spent years keeping to myself. A few minutes later, the Admiral entered the room carrying a folder. He walked straight toward me. Emily. Sir. He smiled. I think today's finally going to answer a lot of questions. I looked toward the closed doors leading back into the hallway. I hope so. He nodded gently. So do I. The Admiral wasn't exaggerating. Within 15 minutes, my entire life was beginning to split into 2 parts. The years when my family thought they knew me and everything that came after. A White House staff member handed me a small name badge with a blue stripe across the bottom. Please wear this where it's visible, she said. I clipped it to my jacket. It looked ordinary enough, but almost immediately people started greeting me. Emily, it's good to finally meet you. We've heard wonderful things. None of them sounded rehearsed. These weren't the polite compliments people exchange at networking events. They spoke to me like someone whose work had already touched theirs. That was strange for me. I was used to being anonymous. The cybersecurity world doesn't reward the loudest person in the room. It rewards the one who quietly prevents disasters that never make the evening news. I preferred it that way, or at least I thought I did. A Navy captain walked over carrying 2 coffee cups. I guessed you'd want black. You remembered. He laughed. You've been drinking the same terrible coffee since Norfolk. I smiled. I still claim it's coffee. It's technically a hot brown liquid. We both laughed. His name was David Morales. We'd spent almost 5 years working together at Naval Information Warfare Systems Command in San Diego before he transferred to Washington. Most people outside our field would never recognize his name. Inside our field, people listened when David spoke. He sat beside me. Nervous? A little. I'm just glad we can finally talk about some of this. I nodded. So am I. Although I wasn't completely sure that was true. Keeping secrets had become part of my personality. Living without them suddenly felt exposed. Across the room, I noticed television crews setting up cameras. Not the national evening news. Mostly government media teams and military photographers. This wasn't meant to become a major political story. It was meant to recognize years of work that could finally be discussed publicly, because portions had recently been declassified. That word still sounded strange. Declassified. For nearly 6 years, I'd answered questions with half smiles and careful changes of subject. Now, some of those answers could finally be spoken aloud. Not all of them. Never all. But enough. While we waited, my mind drifted back to the winter that changed everything. January, 4 years earlier. Norfolk, Virginia. A snowstorm had covered the parking lot outside our building, and almost everyone else had gone home early. Our team stayed. A routine system review had uncovered something unusual. At first, it looked like a software glitch. Then another one appeared. Then another. Tiny irregularities, almost invisible, the kind most people would dismiss. Something about them bothered me. I spent 12 straight hours digging through network logs. David stayed with me. Around midnight, I looked at him. This isn't random. No. Someone's testing us. Within 48 hours, we knew someone overseas had been probing vulnerabilities inside systems connected to naval communications. Not trying to steal files, trying to understand how fast we would respond. That was the frightening part. It meant something larger might be coming. The months that followed became a blur of 14-hour workdays. Conference rooms, encrypted briefings, cold pizza, energy drinks, whiteboards filled with diagrams, no weekends, no vacations, no social life. There were nights I slept on a couch in the secure operations center because driving home for 4 hours of sleep didn't make sense. Mom called once during that period. Are you working overtime again? Yeah. You're going to burn yourself out. I know. You really should find a company that appreciates you. I smiled to myself. If only it were that simple. She thought I was writing software updates. I couldn't tell her that hundreds of people across several agencies were racing against a threat none of us fully understood. Months later, the attack finally came. Not the way Hollywood shows it. No dramatic countdown clocks, no giant screens flashing red. Just thousands of automated attempts to exploit weaknesses we'd already identified and quietly repaired. Hours later, it was over. Most Americans never knew anything had happened. That's exactly how success was supposed to look. One senior official summarized it perfectly during our internal briefing. The public will never celebrate this, he smiled. And that's a good thing. Back in the reception room, David nudged my shoulder. You disappeared. Sorry. Remembering. He nodded. I still have nightmares about those months. So do I. Neither of us said another word. We didn't need to. Some experiences don't require explanation. A White House aide entered. We'll begin seating guests shortly. People started gathering folders and adjusting jackets. The Admiral walked toward a small podium near the front of the room. Before we move into the East Room, he said, I want to thank everyone here for honoring your commitments over the years. Today's recognition belongs to every member of this effort, including many whose names still cannot be shared publicly. The room became completely silent. He looked around slowly. We protected sailors who never knew they were in danger. We protected families who never realized there had been a threat. And we protected missions that will remain classified for many years. He paused. That is honorable service. My throat tightened. For years, I'd wondered whether anyone outside our little circle truly understood what we'd sacrificed. Apparently they did. Just as we began moving toward the ceremony, another staff member approached the Admiral. Sir. He leaned closer. The Carter family is asking questions. The Admiral smiled without looking surprised. I imagine they are. He turned toward me. Emily, I'm sorry. He shook his head. You have nothing to apologize for. I don't want today becoming about them. It won't. He lowered his voice. But they're about to learn something they've missed for a very long time. Meanwhile, in another waiting area, my parents were apparently trying to understand why so many senior officers kept nodding politely when they mentioned my name. Mark finally found someone he recognized, a Navy captain he'd served with years earlier. He walked over. Good to see you again. You too. After a few minutes of catching up, Mark casually asked, Do you know why my sister's in the restricted guest section? The captain looked surprised. Emily Carter is your sister. Yeah. The man's eyebrows lifted. I had no idea. What exactly does she do? The captain smiled carefully. I'm afraid that's not really my story to tell. Then he added one sentence that stayed with Mark long afterward. Let's just say a lot of people in uniform owe your sister more than they'll ever be able to say. Mark stood there speechless. For the first time in his life, he realized there was an entire chapter of his little sister's life that existed completely outside his understanding. And for the first time, he wanted to know it. The East Room looked exactly the way you'd imagine if you'd only ever seen it on television. Tall windows let in the late morning light. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling without trying too hard to impress anyone. The gold curtains framed portraits that had watched generations of history unfold. Marines in dress uniforms stood at attention along the walls. Conversations were quiet, respectful, almost reverent. I had never been inside the White House before. For a second, I forgot why I was there. A staff member showed me to my seat in the second row. I glanced across the aisle and immediately spotted my parents. Dad was scanning the room, clearly trying to understand why I wasn't sitting with them. Mom noticed me first. She nudged him. His head turned. For the first time all morning, our eyes met without either of us looking away. His expression wasn't angry anymore. It was confused. Deeply confused. Mark followed my father's gaze. His face showed something I'd never seen before. Not jealousy. Humility. The ceremony began precisely at 10 o'clock. A Marine band ensemble played softly before the Master of Ceremonies stepped to the podium. He welcomed military leaders, civilian employees, veterans, and families. Then he spoke about something that almost nobody outside Washington ever thinks about. Every day, he said, thousands of Americans protect this country without carrying a rifle or flying an aircraft. He paused. They defend networks. They protect communications. They stop attacks before they become headlines. The room remained perfectly still. He wasn't describing one person. He was describing hundreds, maybe thousands, people whose names would never appear in history books. I felt strangely comfortable hearing that. Recognition had never been the reason I stayed. Purpose was, several awards were presented first. A Navy logistics team, an Air Force medical unit, a group of Coast Guard rescue specialists. Each story reminded everyone in the room that service comes in many forms. Then the Master of Ceremonies looked down at the next page. His tone changed. This next recognition honors a civilian whose leadership helped prevent one of the most significant cyber threats ever directed toward United States naval operations. My heartbeat suddenly became very loud. He continued, because of the classified nature of the work, this recognition has been delayed for several years. The room became completely silent. Today, following the recent declassification of selected operational details, we are finally able to acknowledge the extraordinary dedication of this individual and her team. I gripped the edge of my chair. Part of me wished someone else were sitting there. Another part knew there was no turning back. Then I heard my name. Ms. Emily Carter. For a second, I didn't move. The Admiral sitting beside the aisle leaned over slightly. That's your cue. I laughed under my breath. Right. As I stood, I could hear applause filling the room. Not loud, not theatrical. Steady, respectful. The kind of applause people give when they genuinely appreciate years of quiet work. I walked toward the stage. Halfway there, I glanced toward my family. Dad was frozen. Completely frozen. His mouth was slightly open. Mom already had tears running down her face. Mark slowly stood with everyone else. He clapped harder than anyone at our row. Our eyes met for just a second. He gave me a small nod. It said more than words ever could. The Admiral stepped to the podium. Most Americans will never know the full story behind today's recognition. A few people smiled knowingly. And that's appropriate. He looked toward me. For years, Ms. Carter led a civilian team whose work strengthened the security of naval communications during a period of unprecedented cyber activity. He never mentioned classified operations. He never described technical details. He didn't need to. Instead, he said something that stayed with me. We often picture national service in uniform. He paused. But America is also protected by teachers, engineers, nurses, researchers, analysts, and citizens whose commitment asks for no applause. Then he looked directly at me. Emily, thank you for choosing quiet responsibility over public recognition. I swallowed hard. My grandmother would have loved hearing that. The medal itself wasn't enormous. Simple. Elegant. He placed it around my neck and shook my hand. I'm proud of you. Those 4 words hit me harder than receiving the medal. Because they came from someone who had actually seen my work, the Master of Ceremonies asked if I'd like to say a few words. That hadn't been part of the schedule I'd received. For one terrifying second, I considered saying no. Public speaking had never been my strength. Then I remembered all the people whose names still couldn't be spoken. I stepped to the microphone. "Thank you." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. I've spent most of my career avoiding microphones. A few people laughed. "So this is new." The room relaxed. "I accept this recognition on behalf of an extraordinary team." There were nights when we worked until sunrise. There were birthdays we missed. Holidays spent in secure conference rooms. And there are people sitting here today whose contributions remain classified. I looked across the audience. I wish I could tell every one of their stories. You'd understand that protecting our country doesn't always look the way movies make it seem. The room nodded along quietly. Then I stopped for a moment. There is one person I can thank by name. My throat tightened. My grandmother, Helen Carter. I smiled. When I was younger, she told me that some people build monuments. I paused. While others build the foundations underneath them. Several people smiled. I've carried those words with me every day since. Thank you. That was all. Less than 3 minutes, but somehow it felt like the longest speech of my life. After the ceremony ended, guests gathered in adjoining reception rooms. Coffee, cookies, handshakes, conversations. I had barely finished speaking with one retired Marine when I noticed Dad weaving through the crowd toward me. He looked uncertain. That alone was unusual. Before he reached me, a White House staff member stepped politely into his path. "Good afternoon, sir. I'd like a family photo." "Of course." She checked a small list on her tablet. "I'm sorry, but this reception area is reserved for medal recipients and designated guests." Dad blinked. "My daughter's right there." "Yes, sir." "I just need one picture." She smiled kindly. "There will be another family gathering area in approximately 20 minutes. It wasn't rude. It was simply procedure. Still, I couldn't help noticing the irony. Just a few hours earlier, Dad had been convinced I didn't belong inside the White House. Now he couldn't get into my reception area. Life has an odd sense of humor. When the staff member walked away, I crossed the room toward him instead. He looked at the medal around my neck, then at me. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he whispered something I had waited nearly 20 years to hear. "I didn't know." "No," I answered softly. "You didn't." He nodded slowly. "No, I really didn't." For once, there was no excuse, no joke, no explanation. Only the quiet weight of realizing he'd spent years believing he understood his daughter, when he'd never actually asked who she had become. Life has a funny way of returning to normal. The Monday after the White House ceremony, I was back in my office in Crystal City, Virginia, carrying the same travel mug I'd used for years. The security gate still buzzed. The fluorescent lights still hummed. My computer still greeted me with a login screen and a long list of overnight reports. The biggest difference was that a few more people smiled when they saw me. "Morning, Emily. Congratulations." "Nice speech." That was about it. Nobody treated me like a celebrity. Honestly, I wouldn't have known what to do if they had. Our work still had to be done. Threats didn't pause because someone received a medal. By 9 o'clock, I was reviewing vulnerability reports with the same team I'd spent years sitting beside. David walked into the conference room carrying a box. "Donuts?" I laughed. "What are we celebrating?" "You survived public speaking." "I barely survived." He grinned. "I've seen admirals look more nervous than you did." Someone from the back of the room added, "At least you didn't faint." That earned a round of laughter. Within 5 minutes, we were back to discussing software patches. That's one of the things I love about this profession. Yesterday's recognition becomes today's workload. No one lets their ego get too comfortable. The media coverage lasted less than 48 hours. A few newspapers ran short articles about the ceremony. One local television station interviewed a cybersecurity professor from George Mason University about the growing importance of civilian defense specialists. My name appeared in a couple of stories. There were no dramatic headlines, no television interviews, no book offers. Just a few respectful articles explaining that portions of a previously classified operation had recently been declassified and that several civilian employees had been recognized. Exactly the way I wanted it. At work, life stayed remarkably ordinary. Outside of work, things became more complicated. My phone rang Wednesday evening while I was watering the flowers on my townhouse patio. "Dad." I stared at the screen for a long time before answering. "Hello." There was a pause. Then his voice. "Hi, Em." He hadn't called me Em since I was in college. "Hi." I was wondering... Another pause. "Would you have dinner with me? Just me?" "Not Mom. Not Mark. Just us." I leaned against the railing. "What did you have in mind?" There's that little diner you always liked in Alexandria. Mason's Grill. He remembered. I know the one. Friday. I closed my eyes. Part of me wanted to say no. Not because I hated him. Because I wasn't sure I was ready. Years of hurt don't disappear because someone finally realizes they've been wrong. Forgiveness isn't a light switch. Still. I'll meet you there. Friday evening arrived warm and clear. The diner hadn't changed much since my 20s. Blue booths. Black and white tile floor. Fresh pies displayed behind glass. The waitress still called everyone honey. Dad was already sitting in a corner booth when I walked in. He looked older than he had a week earlier. Not physically. Emotionally. He stood when he saw me. You look good. So do you. That wasn't entirely true. He looked tired. We ordered coffee. Neither of us touched it. Finally, he took a deep breath. I've been trying to figure out how to start this conversation. I waited. I suppose the simplest way is, he looked down at his hands. I'm sorry. No excuses, no if, no but. Just, I'm sorry. He rubbed the edge of his coffee mug. I spent years believing I knew who you were. You did know me. No. He shook his head. I knew who I assumed you were. There was a difference. A very important one. He stared out the window for a moment. When Mark joined the Navy, everything was easy for me to understand. I could see the uniforms, the promotions, the ceremonies, the medals. He smiled sadly. I knew how to be proud of that. Then he looked back at me. I never understood your world. You never asked. I know. His voice cracked slightly. And that's the part I can't stop thinking about. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He was admitting something that cost him a great deal to say. I should have asked. I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup. Do you know what hurt the most? He looked at me carefully. I wasn't angry that you didn't know what I did. I couldn't tell you. I understood that. I took a slow breath. What hurt was that after all those years? You never seemed curious. He closed his eyes. I know. I kept waiting. For what? For one question. What question? Emily, are you happy? Silence settled over the table. The kind that only comes after complete honesty. Finally, he whispered, I never asked. No, you didn't. Dinner arrived, but neither of us ate very much. After a while, Dad smiled weakly. You know, what? I've been telling everybody the wrong story. I raised an eyebrow. What story? That I raised one military hero. He chuckled quietly. I guess I actually raised two. I laughed. I'm not military. You know what I mean. I do. For the first time all evening. The conversation felt natural. Not perfect. Just real. A week later, Mark invited me over for a backyard cookout at his house in Annapolis. Just immediate family. No speeches. No awkward announcements. He flipped burgers while pretending not to be nervous. Finally, he walked over carrying 2 bottles of iced tea. I owe you an apology. You don't owe me as much as you think. I laughed at those jokes. You did. I should have known better. You couldn't have known. I could have respected you enough to ask. That sounded familiar. Maybe growth runs in families after all. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking not about classified work, but about ordinary things. His kids, my garden, Mom's obsession with bird feeders, football, vacation plans. For the first time in years, we sounded like siblings instead of strangers who happened to share a last name. My relationship with Dad didn't magically become perfect. Sometimes he still interrupted people. Sometimes he still bragged too much. Old habits don't disappear overnight, but something fundamental had changed. He listened. Really listened. A month after the ceremony, he came to visit my townhouse. As we walked through my small backyard, he noticed a weathered wooden plaque hanging beside the patio. It had my grandmother's favorite words carved into it. Some people build monuments. Others build the foundations underneath them. Dad stood there reading it for a long time. Then he smiled. I finally understand. I looked at him. I think Grandma would have liked that. So do I. Driving home from work now, I often cross the George Washington Memorial Parkway just before sunset. The Potomac reflects the evening light, and for a few quiet minutes, Washington seems almost peaceful. Sometimes I think about that morning outside the White House. I could have humiliated my father. I could have enjoyed every second of proving him wrong. Instead, what stayed with me wasn't revenge. It was perspective. Being underestimated had shaped me, but it didn't have to define me. Real victory wasn't watching my father stand speechless in a crowded room. It was knowing that I never let bitterness become my identity. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this: don't let someone else's limited view of you become your own. Keep doing work that matters, even if no one applauds it today. And if this story reminded you of someone, or maybe even yourself, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs the reminder. Thank you for listening.